The winter of 1966 came hard to the plains of North Dakota. Snow piled against weathered storefronts in the small town of Langdon, a community where everyone knew their neighbors and doors were rarely locked. It was the kind of place where gossip traveled faster than the cold wind that swept across the flat prairie landscape, and where a single tragedy could shake the foundations of trust that held the town together. On the evening of December 14th, a young woman named Evelyn Marie Hallstrom disappeared while walking home from her shift at the local diner, and for nearly 60 years, her case would remain one of the most haunting mysteries in North Dakota history. Evelyn was 23 years old, with blonde hair that she wore in the style of the era and bright blue eyes that her family said could light up even the darkest winter day. She had grown up on a farm outside of town, the youngest of 4 children, and had moved into Langdon proper when she took the job at Rosie's Diner on Main Street. Those who knew her described a woman full of life and ambition, someone who dreamed of saving enough money to attend secretarial school in Fargo and eventually make her way to Minneapolis or perhaps even Chicago. She was engaged to a local farmer named Thomas Bergstrom, and they had planned to marry the following spring. Her entire life stretched out before her with promise and hope, until that frigid December night when she vanished without a trace. The disappearance sent shockwaves through Langdon, a town of fewer than 2,000 residents where violent crime was virtually unheard of. Evelyn had finished her evening shift at the diner around 9 o'clock, bundling up in her wool coat and saying goodnight to the owner and the cook who were closing up for the night. Her small apartment was only 6 blocks away, a walk she had made hundreds of times before. The streets were quiet that night. The temperature had dropped well below zero, and most sensible people were already home by their fires or tucked into bed. When Evelyn failed to arrive for her morning shift the next day, her coworkers initially assumed she might be ill. But when the diner owner went to check on her at the apartment and found the door locked and no sign that she had returned home the previous night, alarm bells began to ring. Thomas Bergstrom was the first to contact the sheriff's department, his voice shaking as he reported that his fiancée had not come home and no one had seen her since she left work. The local sheriff, a man named Harold Kinsley, organized a search party within hours. Volunteers from across the county turned out despite the brutal cold, combing through snow drifts and checking abandoned buildings, barns, and shelters. They walked the route between the diner and Evelyn's apartment over and over, looking for any sign of struggle or evidence that might explain what had happened. For 3 agonizing days, the search continued with growing desperation. Then, on the morning of December 17th, a farmer discovered Evelyn's body in a ravine approximately 12 miles outside of town, partially covered by snow and fallen branches. The discovery transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a homicide, and it sent the small community into a state of shock and fear that would linger for generations. The county coroner determined that Evelyn had been strangled, and there were signs that she had been assaulted before her death. Her coat and purse were never recovered, and there were no witnesses who had seen anything unusual on the night she disappeared. The investigation that followed was the largest criminal inquiry the region had ever seen, with state police brought in to assist the overwhelmed local sheriff's department. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, everyone from Evelyn's family and friends to customers at the diner to drifters who might have been passing through the area. They collected fingerprints and searched for physical evidence, but forensic technology in 1966 was primitive compared to modern standards, and the leads quickly dried up. Several suspects emerged in the early days and weeks of the investigation, each one scrutinized and ultimately cleared, or lost to the limitations of the era's detective work. Thomas Bergstrom, despite his obvious grief and cooperation with authorities, faced suspicion simply because statistics showed that perpetrators were often close to their victims. He submitted to multiple interviews and provided alibis that were corroborated by family members who confirmed he had been at the farm the night Evelyn vanished. A drifter who had been seen in town around the time of the murder was tracked down and questioned in Montana, but he had moved on before the crime occurred and had witnesses who placed him elsewhere. There were rumors about a regular customer at the diner who had supposedly made Evelyn uncomfortable with his attention, but detectives found no concrete evidence linking him to the crime, and he too was eventually ruled out. As weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the case grew cold despite the best efforts of investigators. The file remained open, but active leads disappeared and the trail went silent. Evelyn's family held a funeral and laid her to rest in the cemetery on the edge of town, and her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who remembered her and mourned the injustice of her stolen future. Thomas Bergstrom never married, carrying the weight of his lost love until his own death in 2008. The diner where Evelyn had worked eventually closed, replaced by other businesses over the decades, but old-timers in Langdon never forgot the young woman who had been taken from them. Parents warned their children to be careful, to never walk alone at night, and the case became a dark legend that hung over the community like a shadow. Over the years, various detectives with the state police and local departments would periodically re-examine the case file, hoping that fresh eyes might spot something previous investigators had missed. The evidence collected at the scene, including samples of biological material found on Evelyn's clothing, was carefully preserved according to the standards of the time. In the 1970s and 80s, as forensic science advanced, some of this evidence was re-examined using newer techniques, but the technology still was not sophisticated enough to provide definitive answers. DNA profiling emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s as a revolutionary tool for solving crimes, and the Hallstrom case was among those where evidence was sent away for testing. A partial DNA profile was developed from the biological evidence, but without a match in the criminal databases that were still in their infancy, it provided little actionable information. The case might have remained unsolved indefinitely, relegated to the dusty archives of North Dakota's cold case files, if not for the dramatic advances in forensic genetic genealogy that emerged in the 2010s and 2020s. This innovative technique combined traditional DNA analysis with genealogical research, allowing investigators to identify suspects by tracing their family trees through DNA matches with relatives who had submitted their genetic information to public ancestry databases. The method gained widespread attention in 2018 when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer in California, a serial predator who had evaded capture for decades. Following that breakthrough, law enforcement agencies across the country began revisiting cold cases with biological evidence, hoping that genetic genealogy might finally provide the answers that had eluded them for so long. In 2023, the North Dakota Attorney General's Cold Case Unit received a grant specifically designated for applying genetic genealogy techniques to unsolved homicides from the 1960s and 70s. The Evelyn Hallstrom case was selected as one of the priority investigations due to the well-preserved biological evidence and the detailed documentation that early investigators had maintained. The evidence was sent to a specialized laboratory that focused on extracting and analyzing degraded DNA from old cases, and technicians worked for months to develop a complete genetic profile that could be used for genealogical comparison. By the spring of 2024, they had successfully created a profile suitable for uploading to genealogy databases, where millions of people had voluntarily shared their DNA information in hopes of learning about their ancestry and finding relatives. The genetic genealogy investigation was led by a team that included forensic experts, professional genealogists, and veteran detectives who understood the nuances of both science and traditional investigative work. When the DNA profile from the Hallstrom case was uploaded to the databases, it generated matches with several individuals who shared genetic markers with the unknown suspect. None of these matches were close relatives. The connections were at the level of third or fourth cousins, but they provided crucial starting points for building a family tree. Genealogists began the painstaking work of tracing these family lines backward through generations, using birth records, marriage certificates, census data, and other historical documents to map out the relationships and identify common ancestors who would have lived in the 19th century. Over several months, the team constructed elaborate family trees that branched out in multiple directions, eventually encompassing thousands of individuals. The genealogists looked for branches of these trees that would have placed potential suspects in North Dakota during the 1960s, cross-referencing their findings with geographical records, city directories, and other sources that might indicate where family members had lived. The work was meticulous and exhausting, requiring expertise in both genetic interpretation and historical research. Dead ends were common, and many promising leads resulted in individuals who were either deceased, the wrong age, or could be definitively ruled out through other means. But gradually, the team began to narrow their focus on a particular family line that had strong ties to the Langdon area during the relevant time period. The investigation eventually pointed to a man named Robert Eugene Larson, who had been 28 years old in 1966 and had lived in a small farmhouse approximately 15 miles from Langdon. Genealogists determined that Larson was a distant cousin of several individuals whose DNA had matched with the crime scene profile, and his position on the family tree aligned with what would be expected given the genetic markers. Detectives began pulling every available record on Larson, constructing a detailed picture of his life and movements. What they discovered was both illuminating and disturbing. Larson had been questioned briefly during the original investigation, his name appearing on a list of local men who had been at a feed store in Langdon on the day of Evelyn's disappearance. But he had not been considered a serious suspect, and the interview had been cursory at best. There had been no reason at the time to focus on him more intensely. Further research revealed that Larson had moved away from North Dakota in the spring of 1967, relocating to Washington State where he found work in the logging industry. He had married in 1971 and had raised 3 children in a small town east of Seattle. To all outward appearances, he had lived an unremarkable life, working steadily, attending church, and participating in community activities. He had no criminal record beyond a few minor traffic violations, and those who knew him in Washington described him as quiet and reserved but generally friendly. He had died in 2019 at the age of 81, taking whatever secrets he might have held to his grave. The revelation that he could not be prosecuted, that he had lived a full life and passed away peacefully while Evelyn's family had suffered for decades without answers, added a bitter dimension to the case. Despite Larson's death, investigators were determined to confirm his involvement through every available means. They needed to obtain a direct DNA sample from Larson to make a definitive comparison with the crime scene evidence, a task that presented significant challenges given that he had been deceased for several years and had been cremated. The investigative team reached out to Larson's surviving children, explaining the situation with sensitivity and care. The children, now adults in their 50s, were shocked and disbelieving at first. They had known their father as a devoted parent who had worked hard to provide for his family, and the suggestion that he might have been responsible for a brutal murder more than 50 years earlier seemed impossible. Yet they also recognized the importance of finding the truth, and after extensive discussions with investigators and among themselves, they agreed to provide their own DNA samples for comparison. The samples from Larson's children were analyzed and compared against the crime scene DNA, and the results were conclusive. The probability that someone other than Robert Eugene Larson had been the source of the biological evidence found on Evelyn Hallstrom's clothing was astronomically small, well beyond the threshold required for legal certainty. Investigators had found their man, nearly 60 years after the crime. The North Dakota Attorney General scheduled a press conference for early November 2025 to announce the breakthrough, inviting members of Evelyn's surviving family and representatives from the law enforcement agencies that had worked on the case over the decades. The news was carefully embargoed until the official announcement to ensure that family members heard the information directly from investigators rather than through media reports. The press conference took place on a gray November morning in Bismarck, the state capital, in a government building conference room packed with journalists, law enforcement officials, and members of the public who had followed the case over the years. The Attorney General stood at a podium flanked by state investigators and representatives from the forensic genetic genealogy team that had broken the case open. The announcement that the Evelyn Hallstrom murder had been solved after nearly 6 decades generated immediate headlines across North Dakota and beyond, with news outlets scrambling to cover a story that bridged generations and highlighted both the persistence of investigators and the power of modern forensic science. For the surviving members of Evelyn's family, including nieces and nephews who had been born long after her death but had grown up hearing stories about their aunt. The news brought a complex mixture of relief, grief, and vindication. The revelation that Robert Eugene Larson had been responsible for Evelyn's murder sent shockwaves through the small community in Washington, where he had lived for more than 50 years. Neighbors and friends struggled to reconcile the man they had known with the horrific crime he had committed as a younger man in North Dakota. Many expressed disbelief, insisting that there must have been some mistake, that the quiet man who had coached Little League and volunteered at the local food bank could not possibly have been a murderer. Others recalled small oddities in Larson's behavior over the years, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on darker implications. There were stories of how he had been unusually controlling with his wife, how he had occasionally displayed flashes of temper that seemed out of proportion to the situation, how he had discouraged his children from asking too many questions about his life before Washington. Larson's children found themselves in an impossibly difficult position, grieving the loss of the father they thought they had known while grappling with the reality of what he had done. In a statement released through their attorney, they expressed sympathy for Evelyn's family and acknowledged the pain that the crime had caused. They emphasized that they had had no knowledge of their father's past and that they were cooperating fully with investigators. The statement also revealed that, in going through old family documents and photographs after learning of the investigation, they had found a few items that may have been connected to their father's time in North Dakota, including a photograph of a young woman who might have been Evelyn, though it was difficult to tell from the faded and damaged image. These materials were turned over to authorities for further examination. Investigators working on the case began the process of reconstructing what might have happened on that December night in 1966, using the new identification of Larson as a suspect to re-examine old evidence and interview notes with fresh perspective. They determined that Larson had likely encountered Evelyn as she walked home from the diner, possibly offering her a ride due to the extreme cold. Whether she had known him casually through the small town's interconnected social networks or had been a complete stranger to him remained unclear. At some point during or after the encounter, Larson had attacked her, and after committing the murder, he had driven her body out to the ravine where it was later discovered. The lack of her coat and purse suggested that he had disposed of these items separately, possibly burning them or throwing them into a body of water where they would never be recovered. The question of why Larson had moved away from North Dakota just a few months after the murder became a focal point of the investigation. Detectives theorized that the intense scrutiny and investigation that followed Evelyn's death had made Larson nervous, even though he had managed to avoid serious suspicion at the time. By relocating to Washington and building a new life far from the scene of the crime, he had effectively hidden in plain sight for the rest of his life. There was no evidence that he had committed any similar crimes in Washington or anywhere else, which raised difficult questions about whether the Hallstrom murder had been an opportunistic act of violence or whether there were other victims that had never been connected to Larson. Investigators indicated that they would be reviewing unsolved cases from the Pacific Northwest to determine if there were any potential links, though they cautioned that such connections would be difficult to establish definitively. The resolution of the case prompted broader discussions about the role of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases and the ethical considerations surrounding the use of DNA databases that were originally intended for ancestry research. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the implications of law enforcement accessing genetic information that people had shared voluntarily for recreational purposes, arguing that individuals should have the right to control how their DNA data is used. Supporters of the technique countered that solving violent crimes and bringing closure to families outweighed these concerns, especially when the databases used were public and people had consented to sharing their information. The debate played out in newspapers, online forums, and legislative hearings, reflecting broader societal tensions about privacy, security, and justice in an age of rapidly advancing technology. For the community of Langdon, the news that Evelyn's killer had been identified brought a sense of closure that many had thought would never come. At a town hall meeting held shortly after the announcement, current and former residents gathered to discuss the case and reflect on its impact over the decades. Older residents shared memories of Evelyn and the fear that had gripped the town after her disappearance, while younger people expressed amazement that such a terrible crime had occurred in their quiet community. The mayor announced plans to install a memorial plaque in the town park honoring Evelyn's memory and acknowledging the persistence of the investigators who had never given up on finding her killer. There was also discussion about updating the small museum that documented local history to include information about the case and its eventual resolution as a reminder of both the tragedy and the importance of pursuing justice, no matter how much time has passed. Evelyn's grave in the Langdon Cemetery became a site of renewed attention following the announcement, with visitors leaving flowers and small tokens of remembrance. Her surviving relatives, including a nephew who had become the family's spokesperson, held a small private ceremony at the gravesite to mark the resolution of the case. In an interview afterward, the nephew spoke about the mixture of emotions the family was experiencing. There was relief that they finally knew what had happened and who was responsible, but there was also renewed grief for the loss of Evelyn and frustration that Larson had never faced justice in a courtroom. He expressed gratitude to the investigators who had worked on the case over the years, particularly those who had pursued the genetic genealogy angle that ultimately cracked it, and he hoped that the resolution might provide some measure of peace for the community that had been haunted by the unsolved murder for so long. The technical aspects of how the case was solved fascinated many people and led to increased interest in forensic genetic genealogy as a field. The laboratory that had processed the DNA evidence released a detailed report explaining the challenges of working with biological material that was nearly 60 years old and had been stored under less than ideal conditions for much of that time. Advances in DNA extraction and sequencing technology had made it possible to recover usable genetic information from samples that would have been considered too degraded just a few years earlier. The genealogists who had worked on building the family trees described the complexity of tracing lineages back through multiple generations and then forward again to identify potential suspects, a process that required not only technical skill but also creativity and persistence. Their work highlighted a growing field that combined genetics, history, and traditional detective work in novel ways. The case also raised questions about other unsolved murders from the same era in North Dakota and across the country. Law enforcement agencies announced that they would be reviewing their cold case files to identify other investigations that might benefit from genetic genealogy techniques. The Attorney General's office indicated that the grant that had funded the Hallstrom investigation would be used to pursue several additional cases, with priority given to those involving violent crimes and where biological evidence had been preserved. There was recognition that many families across the state had been waiting for decades for answers about lost loved ones, and the success of the Hallstrom case provided hope that closure might be possible even in investigations that had long been considered unsolvable. In the months following the announcement, journalists and true crime enthusiasts dug deeper into both Evelyn's life and Robert Larson's background, piecing together more complete pictures of both the victim and the perpetrator. Articles and podcasts explored Evelyn's dreams and aspirations, her relationships with family and friends, and the vibrant young woman she had been before her life was cut short. Others examined Larson's history, looking for clues that might explain how someone could commit such a terrible crime and then live for decades afterward without apparently reoffending or showing obvious signs of violent tendencies. Psychologists and criminologists weighed in with theories about compartmentalization, guilt, and the capacity of human beings to hide terrible secrets even from those closest to them. One particularly revealing discovery came when investigators located Larson's personal effects that his children had stored in boxes after his death. Among old photographs, letters, and miscellaneous documents, they found a diary that Larson had kept sporadically during his years in Washington. The entries were mostly mundane observations about work and family life, but there were occasional passages that hinted at inner turmoil and regret. In one entry from 1983, Larson had written cryptically about mistakes made in youth and the impossibility of ever truly escaping one's past. In another from the mid-1990s, he mentioned nightmares about snow and darkness. These fragments provided tantalizing glimpses into Larson's psychological state, but stopped short of explicit confession or detailed admission of guilt. Legal experts noted that even if Larson had been alive, such diary entries would have been of limited evidentiary value without the DNA evidence to corroborate them. The Larson family's cooperation with the investigation was praised by law enforcement and victim advocates, who recognized how difficult it must have been for them to come forward and provide DNA samples that would confirm their father's guilt. Some victims' rights organizations used the case as an example in their advocacy for laws requiring convicted criminals and even arrestees to provide DNA samples for databases, arguing that earlier collection and cataloging of genetic information might have solved cases like Hallstrom's decades sooner. Others pointed out that Larson had never been arrested or convicted of any crime that would have required DNA submission under existing laws, making his case an argument for the value of genetic genealogy rather than expanded mandatory DNA collection. The emotional impact of the case extended far beyond those directly involved. Across North Dakota, the resolution of such a long-standing mystery prompted many people to reflect on their own experiences with crime, loss, and the passage of time. Support groups for families of murder victims reported increased attendance and interest in the months following the announcement, as people who had been living with unresolved grief found renewed hope that their own cases might someday be solved. Therapists and counselors noted an uptick in clients wanting to process old traumas that the Hallstrom case had brought back to the surface. The story became a catalyst for conversations about healing, justice, and the ways that communities carry collective wounds across generations. Educational institutions also took notice of the case, with several universities in North Dakota and neighboring states incorporating it into their criminal justice and forensic science curricula. Students analyzed the investigation as a case study in the evolution of forensic technology and the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate solutions seem impossible. Law schools used the case to explore questions about post-mortem investigations, the rights of deceased suspects' families, and the ethical boundaries of genetic privacy. The interdisciplinary nature of the investigation, combining cutting-edge science with traditional detective work and historical research, made it a valuable teaching tool across multiple fields. For the genealogists who had worked on the case, the successful identification of Larson represented validation of their emerging field and the specialized skills they brought to criminal investigations. Several members of the team gave presentations at law enforcement conferences and forensic science symposiums, sharing their methodologies and lessons learned. They emphasized the importance of rigorous documentation, careful interpretation of genetic data, and collaboration between scientists and investigators. The Hallstrom case became a reference point in discussions about best practices for genetic genealogy investigations, particularly regarding how to handle the complex family dynamics that often arise when distant relatives learn their DNA has led to a suspect's identification. As Winter returned to North Dakota in late 2025, nearly 60 years after Evelyn Hallstrom's murder, the landscape looked much different than it had in 1966. The small farms that had defined the region were fewer and larger, many swallowed up by corporate agricultural operations. Langdon itself had shrunk, like many rural communities, with young people moving to cities for education and employment. But the memory of Evelyn and the decades-long quest for justice remained a powerful thread connecting past and present. The case had become part of the region's historical fabric, a story passed down through families and taught in schools as a reminder of both tragedy and perseverance. The memorial plaque that was installed in Langdon's Town Park in December 2025, on the 59th anniversary of Evelyn's disappearance, drew a substantial crowd despite bitter cold temperatures that echoed that long-ago winter night. Evelyn's elderly nephew, now in his late 70s, spoke briefly about his aunt and what she had meant to the family. He thanked the investigators, scientists, and genealogists who had worked to solve the case, and he expressed hope that the resolution would allow Evelyn's memory to be defined by her life and dreams rather than solely by her tragic death. Local clergy offered prayers, and a children's choir from the elementary school sang hymns that would have been familiar in Evelyn's time. As snow began to fall gently on the gathered crowd, there was a sense of something important coming full circle. The North Dakota Attorney General used the occasion to announce that 4 additional cold cases from the 1960s through the 1980s would be prioritized for genetic genealogy investigation, with work beginning in early 2026. The announcement was met with cautious optimism from families who had been waiting years or even decades for progress in their loved ones' cases. There was recognition that not every investigation would end as successfully as the Hallstrom case, that some evidence might be too degraded or incomplete for modern techniques to yield results, but the possibility of answers where none had seemed possible before represented a profound shift in how cold cases were approached. Media coverage of the case extended internationally, with news outlets in Europe, Australia, and Asia picking up the story as an example of how technology was revolutionizing criminal investigations. Documentary filmmakers expressed interest in telling the full story of Evelyn's murder and its eventual solution, though any such projects would require careful navigation of the sensitivities involved, particularly regarding the Larson family's privacy and the dignity of Evelyn's memory. True crime podcasters had already produced multiple episodes about the case, with varying degrees of accuracy and taste, prompting discussions about ethical storytelling and the responsibilities that come with examining real tragedies for entertainment purposes. The case also had implications for how evidence was preserved and stored in criminal investigations. Police departments and sheriff's offices across North Dakota and other states conducted audits of their evidence storage facilities, identifying cold cases where biological material had been retained and assessing whether that material might be suitable for genetic genealogy analysis. There was renewed emphasis on proper evidence handling and storage procedures, with the Hallstrom case serving as a powerful example of why seemingly unsolvable cases should never have their physical evidence destroyed. Training programs for law enforcement personnel incorporated modules on evidence preservation, with an eye toward future technologies that might not yet exist but could someday provide breakthroughs. For those who had worked on the Hallstrom case over the decades, many of whom were long retired or deceased by the time it was solved, the resolution represented the culmination of countless hours of work that had often seemed futile. The original sheriff, Harold Kinsley, had passed away in 1994, never knowing that the killer would eventually be identified. The state police detective who had taken over the case in the 1970s had died in 2012. But their work, their careful documentation and preservation of evidence had made the eventual solution possible. Current investigators made a point of acknowledging these contributions, recognizing that solving cold cases was often a relay race where earlier runners laid the groundwork for later breakthroughs, even if they never saw the finish line themselves. In Washington state, where Robert Larson had lived the majority of his life, the revelation of his crime prompted soul searching within the community, and particularly within the church he had attended for decades. How could someone who had committed such a terrible act present himself as a normal, even upstanding member of society? How had no one suspected? Religious leaders and counselors grappled with questions about the nature of evil, the possibility of redemption, and whether Larson's outwardly decent life after the murder represented genuine change or merely successful camouflage. There were no easy answers, and different people within the community reached different conclusions about what the case meant for their understanding of human nature and morality. Larson's widow, who had married him 5 years after Evelyn's murder and had had no knowledge of his crime, found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. In the one brief statement she released through an attorney, she expressed shock and horror at learning what her late husband had done. She noted that in their decades of marriage, Larson had never shown violence toward her or their children, had never given any indication of his past crime. She expressed sympathy for Evelyn's family and asked for privacy as she processed this shattering revelation about the man she had thought she knew. Friends reported that she had largely withdrawn from public life, struggling to reconcile her memories with this new and terrible knowledge. The psychological impact on Larson's children was particularly acute. They had not only lost their father to death, but had now lost the memory of who they thought he had been. Adult children of criminals often report feeling a sense of shame and confusion about their own identities, questioning what it means to be the child of someone capable of terrible acts. Support groups and therapists specializing in this unique form of trauma found themselves working with the Larson children as they navigated grief, anger, shame, and a fundamental crisis of identity. Their cooperation with the investigation had been the right thing to do, but it had come at an enormous personal cost. As the first anniversary of the case's resolution approached, Evelyn's family worked with local historians to compile a more complete record of her life, wanting to ensure that she would be remembered as a person rather than simply as a victim. They gathered photographs, letters she had written, and reminiscences from the few people still living who had known her personally. This material was compiled into a small booklet that was made available at the Langdon Library and Museum, offering a portrait of a young woman who had loved movies and music, who had been kind to animals, who had dreamed of traveling and seeing more of the world. It was an effort to reclaim Evelyn's narrative from the violence that had ended her life. The resolution of the Hallstrom case had ripple effects on other investigations across the country. Detectives working on cold cases began reaching out to genetic genealogy experts, and laboratories specializing in this work found themselves overwhelmed with requests. The field was growing rapidly, but there were concerns about quality control and the need for standardization as more practitioners entered the space. Professional organizations began developing certification programs and ethical guidelines to ensure that genetic genealogy investigations were conducted rigorously and responsibly. The Hallstrom case was frequently cited in these discussions as an example of how the technique should work when done properly. In Langdon, life continued with its normal rhythms even as the community processed the significance of what had happened. The high school football team played its games, the Lutheran church held its services, farmers worked their fields through the seasons. But there was a subtle shift in how people talked about their town's history, a recognition that even the darkest chapters could eventually reach some form of resolution. The fear that had lingered for decades, the unspoken worry that whoever had killed Evelyn Hallstrom might still be among them or might strike again, had finally been laid to rest. There was grief for the years of not knowing, but also gratitude that the truth had finally emerged. The case became a touchstone for discussions about justice and what it means when it comes decades late. Some argued that identifying Larson after his death provided only partial closure, that true justice required a perpetrator to face trial and punishment. Others contended that knowing the truth, even without a criminal prosecution, was itself a form of justice that honored Evelyn's memory and validated the suffering her family had endured. Legal scholars debated whether there should be mechanisms for post-mortem proceedings that could officially establish guilt even when criminal punishment was impossible, perhaps providing a form of vindication for victims' families and historical record. The financial costs of solving the case were substantial, running into hundreds of thousands of dollars when accounting for the specialized DNA analysis, genealogical research, investigative time, and other resources. Some questioned whether such expenditures were justified for cases where the suspect was deceased and no prosecution was possible. But victim advocates and many in law enforcement argued that the cost was worthwhile, that society's commitment to solving murders should not expire simply because time has passed or a suspect has died. The closure provided to families and communities, and the message sent that murders would be investigated no matter how long it took, were seen as valuable in themselves. As genetic genealogy became more established as an investigative tool, questions arose about its use in cases less serious than murder. Should the technique be applied to unsolved rapes, armed robberies, or other violent felonies? What about property crimes? Where should the line be drawn between crimes serious enough to justify the technique's use and those that were not? Different jurisdictions began developing their own policies, with most limiting genetic genealogy to violent crimes where biological evidence existed. The discussions reflected broader societal debates about resource allocation in criminal justice and the prioritization of different types of cases. The Hallstrom case also highlighted generational differences in attitudes toward privacy and DNA testing. Older individuals who had not grown up with consumer genetic testing often expressed discomfort with the idea that their genetic information could be used to identify distant relatives involved in crimes. Younger people who had come of age in an era of social media and routine sharing of personal information online were generally more accepting of the practice, viewing it as a reasonable tool for solving serious crimes. These generational divides played out in families, communities, and policy discussions about the future of forensic genetic genealogy. For the field of forensic science more broadly, the successful resolution of the Hallstrom case represented both an achievement and a challenge. It demonstrated the incredible power of combining traditional investigative techniques with cutting-edge genetic analysis, but it also raised the bar for what was considered possible in cold case investigations. Families of murder victims who had been told their cases were unsolvable now had reason to push for renewed investigation, creating pressure on law enforcement agencies that often lacked the resources to pursue every case with expensive genetic genealogy techniques. The success became both an inspiration and a burden. In the years that would follow the Hallstrom case's resolution, genetic genealogy would continue to evolve and mature as a forensic tool. More cases would be solved, techniques would be refined, and policies would be developed to govern its use. But the Hallstrom case would remain significant as one of the investigations that demonstrated the technique's potential and highlighted the questions it raised. Evelyn Marie Hallstrom, who had disappeared on that cold December night in 1966 with her whole life ahead of her, had become in death a catalyst for advances in forensic science and discussions about justice, privacy, and the endurance of truth. The story of her murder and its eventual resolution would be told and retold in the years ahead, in classrooms and conference rooms, in courtrooms and community gatherings. It would be a story about persistence and patience, about science and dedication, about the ways that time could both obscure and eventually reveal the truth. It would be a story about a young woman whose life was stolen and a community that never forgot her, about an investigation that spanned generations, and the people who refused to let her case fade into obscurity. And it would be a story about the man who killed her, who lived for decades with his secret, and whose identity was finally revealed through the persistence of investigators and the power of a science that had not even existed when he committed his crime. The resolution of Evelyn's case brought both an ending and a beginning. It ended nearly 60 years of uncertainty and searching, providing answers that her family and community had desperately needed. But it also marked the beginning of new chapters in how cold cases would be investigated, how families would seek justice for lost loved ones, and how society would grapple with the implications of powerful new forensic technologies. Evelyn Marie Hallstrom, who had dreamed of secretarial school and life in a big city, who had loved her family and fiancé, who had been taken far too soon, would be remembered not just for how she died, but for what her case had ultimately meant. In a small cemetery on the edge of Langdon, her grave stood as a reminder of both tragedy and perseverance, loss and eventual resolution, marking a story that had finally, after so many years, reached its conclusion.